This video is sponsored by Incogni. In October 1971, American nuclear-powered submarine USS Halibut slipped into the frigid waters of the Sea of Okhotsk. Navy divers emerged from the vessel, descending 400 feet below the water's surface where they located their target, an undersea communications cable transmitting mostly unencrypted messages between two key Soviet naval bases. The divers proceeded to attach a 20-foot-long recording device to the cable. Once they completed their mission, they returned to the Halibut, which shrunk back into the shadowy depths of the sea. For the next 10 years, American intelligence listened in to all Soviet communications transmitted along the cable. Considered by many as the most important intelligence-gathering operation of the Cold War, the US learned of Soviet submarine and missile technology, its state of military preparedness, and its nuclear first strike capabilities. But then suddenly in 1980, the messages stopped. Operation Ivy Bells, a joint Navy, NSA, and CIA operation, was over. That the undersea wiretap had been discovered by the Soviets by chance was highly unlikely. The compromise of Operation Ivy Bells must have been an inside job. It would only be years later that American intelligence would discover the man behind the compromise. The National Security Agency prides itself in being the chief collector and protector of US and international signals intelligence. Yet, as closely as it guards its secrets, the NSA learned the hard way that it is not immune to betrayal from within. Enter Ronald W. Pelton. Born in 1941 in Benton Harbor, Michigan, Pelton journeyed from an ordinary, outwardly patriotic American citizen to a notorious Cold War spy and traitor. He was just one among many Americans nabbed during the infamous Year of the Spy in 1985. Throughout his schooling, Ronald Pelton was a good student, graduating in the top quarter of his class in high school. He then joined the US Air Force, where he spent 4 years working as an intelligence analyst at American bases in Texas and then Pakistan. He demonstrated an aptitude for languages, and given the ongoing Cold War, put his talents to good use by taking a Russian language course. Pelton was discharged from the Navy in 1964 and moved back to his hometown, where he lived an ordinary middle-class life as a TV repairman. That same year, Ronald married a woman by the name of Judith, and together they had their first child. Pelton's linguistic and analytical talents were, however, such that in 1965 he was drawn back into the world of intelligence, being recruited that year by the National Security Agency. He worked a civilian role specializing in operations against the Soviet Union. Although he showed signs of early promise and was evidently a clever analyst, he was considered immature and arrogant by his colleagues, having an ego which he couldn't control. While assigned to work in the United Kingdom between 1966 and 1972, Pelton was reprimanded by his superiors after it was found out that he broke into a casino slot machine and made off with the equivalent of $13.50. It also came to light that he was having an affair with the wife of one of his NSA colleagues, resulting in the wife and the colleague being sent back to the USA. Despite working 14 years for the NSA, Ronald Pelton never managed to rise very high in the organization. Although he earned a respectable middle-class annual income of $24,500, Pelton then had a wife and 4 children to support. Ever the schemer and a borderline spendthrift, the seams of Pelton's personal life began to split as the 1970s drew to a close. You don't need to be an NSA agent to appreciate that your personal data on the internet is constantly at risk. Incogni is a service designed to help you reclaim your personal data and maintain your privacy online. Incogni steps in to shield you from the ever-present danger of your data being sold or exposed in a data breach. Every time you browse the web, there are dozens of companies tracking, collecting, and selling your personal data. You should care about this given how prevalent online identity theft has become in recent years. Incogni can request these companies to delete your data on your behalf. It's like having your own automated personal data protection agency. If you're anything like me, you've probably created accounts on dozens of online services and websites. Over time, your data gets scattered across the internet and becomes ripe for the picking. Incogni can help you to identify and remove your personal information from these online databases. All you need to do is sign up, give Incogni permission to work on your behalf, and let them know what information you want removed, then kick back and watch them work. Take control of your personal data today with Incogni. Click the link in the description and use the code Philip to get 60% off an annual plan. By the end of the 1970s, Ronald Pelton was facing a predicament. He was in dire financial straits after running up large debts in a home building project. The new home he planned for his family saw massive cost overruns, thanks in part, Pelton claimed, to the theft of building materials from the construction site. Drowning in debt, Pelton filed for bankruptcy in 1979. He feared that his financial status might jeopardize his security clearance and thus his job at the NSA. Doubting that he would be able to pass his next routine polygraph examination, Pelton chose to retire from the NSA rather than face an embarrassing exit. After leaving the NSA in July 1979, he took up a job as a salesman for a boat builder in Annapolis, a far cry from his former career in high-stakes intelligence work. His dreams of getting rich selling yachts were, however, unfulfilled. He barely managed to eke out a living, and with just a few $100s in his bank account and facing a mountain of debt, Ronald Pelton started to scheme. Although he was officially out of the intelligence game, he knew that his country's chief enemy and rival, the Soviet Union, would pay well for the NSA secrets he still retained in his head. Ronald Pelton is said to have had a photographic memory, and he could recall in vivid detail all the NSA secrets he had become privy to. From joint covert operations to what the US knew and what it didn't know about Russian ciphers and encrypted communications. Desperate for cash, Pelton made a fateful phone call to the Soviet embassy in Washington, D.C. on the 14th of January 1980. He stammered his way through telling the person on the line that he worked for the American government. With that, he was invited to a meeting at the embassy, which was agreed would take place the next night under cover of darkness. As it so happened, the FBI was listening in to his phone call via a wiretap on the embassy's phone lines. Nobody recognized the caller's voice, but as they always maintained eyes on the Soviet embassy, the FBI hoped to get a visual on their would-be traitor when he visited the next night. The FBI was, however, taken by surprise when at 2:32 p.m., the mystery traitor called the embassy again, saying that he would be there within the next 2 minutes. The FBI agents on duty that day scrambled to catch a glimpse of the man, but were unable to get a positive ID, as they only saw his back as the man slipped in behind embassy gates. Once inside the embassy, Pelton talked with Vitaly Yurchenko, a KGB officer in charge of embassy security. From that moment, the two men's fates would be forever intertwined. Yurchenko introduced himself to the squat, red-haired American man using an alias. After sussing him out with some preliminary questions, Yurchenko determined that the self-proclaimed former NSA employee was worth talking to. Yurchenko went upstairs to call his boss, Station Chief and KGB Colonel Viktor Cherkashin. He told him that there was a man downstairs wanting to trade NSA secrets for cash. Ronald Pelton didn't mince his words or try to hide his intentions. He made it clear that he wanted to make some money. His transparency was a key factor that led the KGB to believe that Pelton, a classic walk-in or volunteer spy, was genuine and not a CIA dangle. After answering further questions put to him by Yurchenko, the KGB decided to put their trust in the man. As his initial debriefing that day at the embassy drew to its close, the KGB had to figure out a way to get Pelton out the building without being seen. They were well aware that the Soviet embassy was under constant FBI surveillance, so walking out the front door wasn't an option. At the time, the Soviets were undertaking a renovation project at the embassy building. The carpenters, plumbers, and fitters doing the work were all, at great expense, flown in by the Soviets from Russia to avoid hiring Americans. They couldn't be too careful in avoiding the possibility of the FBI planting a spy among the ranks of the tradesmen. It was thus decided that Pelton would stay the night at the embassy and leave with one of the construction crews the next morning. On the 15th of January 1980, freshly shaven and wearing painter's overalls, Pelton slipped out the rear exit of the embassy with a group of workers. He was taken with the other men to a Soviet-owned property in Washington, and from there, driven to and dropped off outside a busy shopping mall. And just like that, Ronald Pelton had given the FBI the slip and was an active Soviet spy. For the next 5 years, Pelton would reveal to the KGB everything he could remember relating to NSA techniques, targets, and intercepts. He would meet with his KGB handler at various public locations around Washington, from restaurants to shopping centers. Although Pelton was no longer an active NSA employee, the KGB placed high value on the intelligence he was able to share, even flying him to Vienna on at least 2 occasions, which was the so-called espionage capital of the world, where for hours on end he unloaded a treasure trove of NSA secrets. The information Pelton betrayed to the KGB related primarily to NSA signals intelligence operations and capabilities. It is believed that he compromised Project Vortex, which was a type of spy satellite developed by the USA in the 1980s. It was designed to operate from high Earth orbit to intercept radio transmissions from Earth or space. However, the most valuable information that Pelton gave to the Soviets was the existence of Operation Ivy Bells. The hugely costly operation to install a telephone tap on the Soviet undersea cable in the Sea of Okhotsk provided America with important insight into Soviet military planning and procedures, including the movements of the Soviet naval fleet and advance warning of missile tests and military exercises planned to take place in the Far East. The Soviets, in their hubris, transmitted much of their communication unencrypted, being overly confident in the security of their undersea line. But all good things must come to an end, and in the case of Operation Ivy Bells, this was thanks to Ronald Pelton. Although the operation ran successfully for 10 years, in 1981, American satellites spotted Soviet ships, including a salvage vessel, anchored over the tap site. The game was up. When an American ship was dispatched a few months later to recover the device, it had vanished, hauled up by the Soviets after being tipped off by Pelton. The compromise of Operation Ivy Bells not only put a stop to the gathering by America of valuable signals intelligence, but also scuppered future expansion plans. Every 6 months, Navy frogmen had to return to the recording device to retrieve the pods containing the taped radio communications. Had the operation continued, the NSA planned to replace the recorders with an always-online system that didn't require the tapes to be changed, which was always a risky exercise. Pelton's clandestine meetings and exchanges of information for cash with the KGB went on for a full 5 years, with Pelton receiving payments totaling $35,000. This sum of money was hardly going to cover the sort of comfy retirement Pelton envisaged for himself, let alone cover his debts. As he continued to spy, his personal and financial life crumbled ever further. He had separated from his wife Judith and had become estranged from his 4 children. In 1984, Pelton started a relationship with Anne Barry, a green-eyed former Miss Maryland beauty contestant whom he met in a bar one night. Sometimes he stayed at her apartment, other nights he slept on a boat or couch surfed. The couple, brought together by their drinking, continued to party hard together, which included dabbling in recreational drug use. With his personal life circling the drain, Pelton had no idea that events across the Iron Curtain were about to spell his doom. The KGB security officer that Pelton first met when he presented himself at the Soviet embassy went on to climb the ranks of Soviet intelligence, becoming a colonel in the KGB. At the height of his career, Vitaly Yurchenko was the deputy chief of the first department within the first chief directorate. This was the Soviet equivalent of the CIA and was the KGB unit responsible for overseas espionage. The first department oversaw and directed spies within the USA and Canada. In other words, he was a big deal, rated by the CIA as the KGB's number 5 man. And so you can imagine the surprise of the CIA when in August 1985, Yurchenko sauntered into the American embassy while on assignment in Rome. There he offered to defect to the West. Hardly able to believe their luck, it was difficult to understand why a man so ensconced in the upper echelons of the KGB leadership would defect. There have been various theories proffered for Yurchenko's motivation, including that he was frustrated with the Soviet system and wanted to escape a troubled family life back home. Another factor was that a former mistress with whom he had had an affair while in Russia had relocated to Canada. Yurchenko had intentions to rekindle the love affair. He was quickly whisked back to the United States, where he was given a fully furnished home, $1 million in cash, and a salary exceeding $60,000 a year. In a safe house in Northern Virginia, Yurchenko was subjected to a rigorous joint debriefing undertaken by the CIA and the FBI. The interviews would stretch over the next 3 months. Among the secrets he divulged was the presence of 2 moles within the ranks of American intelligence. One of these men, known to Yurchenko only by his codename Robert, proved to be former CIA officer Edward Lee Howard. After Howard realized that he was under investigation, he fled, defecting to the Soviet Union. The other traitor that Yurchenko discussed was the NSA agent that had volunteered his services at the Soviet embassy in Washington 5 years prior. Yurchenko could not remember the man's name, seeming to recall only that he went by the name of Mr. Long. Yurchenko did, however, remember a great many other details about the middle-aged, red-haired man who had so enthusiastically offered to sell American secrets that day. When, on the 20th of October 1985, Yurchenko was presented with a raft of color photographs of red-haired men that were either current or former NSA employees, he immediately pointed to the photo of Ronald Pelton. Until Yurchenko's debriefing, Pelton never faced so much as a whiff of suspicion of being a traitor. Fate had intervened to facilitate his downfall. As soon as there was a positive ID of their suspect, the FBI launched Operation Passerine, a large-scale investigation into Ronald Pelton involving as many as 200 FBI agents. The recording of Pelton's initial phone call to the Soviet embassy was played back to dozens of his former NSA colleagues, with at least one positive voice identification finally being made. Pelton was then traced to an apartment in Silver Springs, Maryland, but after days of surveillance, he never turned up. Further investigation led the FBI to Ann Barry's apartment, where Pelton was a regular guest. Once located, Pelton was placed under 24-hour FBI surveillance. His business phone was wiretapped, and listening devices were hidden in his car and his girlfriend's apartment. As the FBI listened, watched, and waited, their surveillance revealed nothing incriminating insofar as espionage was concerned. All they learned was that Ronald and his girlfriend Anne regularly took drugs together, and that Pelton was scheming to defraud a bank. While he could have been charged for this, bank fraud was not what the FBI wanted to nab him for. The surveillance was thus proving fruitless, and the pressure was on for the FBI to move on the man who they knew they couldn't prove as a spy in a court of law. Meanwhile, the FBI's star witness in its case against Ronald Pelton was growing agitated and discontent. The FBI ill-advisedly allowed Yurchenko to take a trip to Canada to meet his former mistress. She was by then a qualified pediatrician and married with 2 children. Yurchenko's hopes were dashed when she rejected his offer to elope and settle down with him in the USA. Adding insult to injury, a crestfallen Yurchenko was then appalled to learn that his defection and some of what had been discussed at his debriefing had been leaked by the CIA to the press. Yurchenko feared reprisals for his family back in Russia. He was also a complicated man and was not without his faults. When stationed in Washington for the KGB, he had bottled the handling of a potential informant, leading to the arrest of the CIA officer concerned before he was even able to sell his secrets to the Soviets. Yurchenko also had multiple affairs with the wives of his colleagues. Among these women was an American who is thought to have been an FBI informant. Yurchenko was also a hypochondriac, living in constant fear that he would get stomach cancer, a fate that had befallen his mother. The Vitaly Yurchenko story then took a dramatic twist on the 2nd of November 1985. Yurchenko was out for dinner with his CIA handler at a restaurant in the Georgetown area of Washington, D.C. This was just a stone's throw away from the Soviet embassy. At one point in the evening, Yurchenko stood up and reportedly said to his handler, "If I'm not back in 15 minutes, don't blame yourself." With those parting words, he left the restaurant, walked half a mile up Wisconsin Avenue and slipped in behind the gates of the Soviet compound. Just 3 months after defecting to the West, Yurchenko was going home to the Soviet Union. In the blink of an eye, the CIA's greatest intelligence coup of the Cold War turned into their worst nightmare. A few days later, Yurchenko appeared in a press conference in which he said that he had been drugged and kidnapped by the CIA. American authorities had no grounds to prevent Yurchenko from returning to the Soviet Union, and so could only look on with embarrassment as the Russian colonel boarded a flight headed for Moscow on the 6th of November 1985. Yurchenko's redefection was not only a major propaganda victory for the Soviet Union, it also presented a major setback in the FBI's investigation into Ronald Pelton. Without their star witness, the FBI had little evidence to fall back on in prosecuting charges of espionage against Pelton. It was decided that it was time to risk a direct approach, in the hopes that Pelton would confess. While this was a gamble, the FBI counted on Pelton's ego to make him talk. The FBI set themselves up in room 409 at the Annapolis Hilton Hotel, and agents David Faulkner and Dudley Hodgson rehearsed their roles for days. On the morning of the 24th of November 1985, Faulkner called Pelton at his place of work, asking to speak to him about a matter of national security. Letting either his ego or his curiosity get the better of him, Pelton agreed to meet, joining the two FBI agents at the Hilton Hotel later that day. Faulkner and Hodgson immediately got to work, regaling Pelton with a tale of a suspected mole, the details of which mirrored Pelton's own life and spying activities. The agents spoke of how the man had compromised Ivy Bells and had betrayed many other secrets of the NSA. They then played Pelton the recording of the man who phoned the Soviet embassy 5 years earlier. Although Pelton denied that he was the man they were after, when confronted by the sound of his own voice being played back on tape, Pelton started to crack. He changed tack, offering to cooperate with the FBI with a view to becoming a double agent. The FBI had no intention of even considering Pelton's offer, but nevertheless allowed him to prattle on about his visits to Vienna and the money he received from the Soviets. As lunchtime drew near, Pelton said that he needed to meet his girlfriend Anne for lunch. Reluctantly, the FBI allowed Pelton to leave, knowing that they didn't have quite enough evidence yet to make an arrest. Pelton was escorted from the hotel, but not before surrendering his passport. Pelton and Anne were watched as they went for lunch and then returned home to Anne's apartment. The FBI telephoned Pelton, urging him to return to the Hilton to answer further questions. Thinking perhaps that his offer of becoming a double agent was still on the cards, Pelton agreed. Once back in the hot seat in the hotel room, it wasn't long before Pelton admitted to handing over secret information to a foreign power, and that he had done so knowing that his actions had harmed American national security and put lives at risk. This was precisely the evidence the FBI needed, and Pelton was promptly arrested. The FBI had made the right call. Thinking that he was always the smartest man in the room, Pelton's ego had got the better of him, with the result that he now faced the prospects of a lengthy prison sentence. Had he remained silent, Pelton might have avoided his arrest. With the FBI's star witness behind the Iron Curtain, their evidence against Pelton was circumstantial at best. The American public was still reeling from half a dozen other American spies rounded up that year, including John Walker and Jonathan Pollard, when the news of Ronald Pelton's arrest was splashed across newspapers nationwide. The revelation of moles within the CIA and the Navy was shocking enough, But nobody ever thought that the most secretive of American intelligence agencies, the one which was jokingly referred to as no such agency, could be the one to be compromised. Despite his confession, Pelton chose to plead not guilty, and the matter went to trial. Although there was little in the way of hard evidence to go on beyond the confession and the taped telephone conversation, on the 5th of June 1986, a jury of his peers found Ronald Pelton guilty on 4 of the 5 charges against him, with a 6th charge being dismissed. Pelton was sentenced to serve 3 concurrent life sentences. The judge in the case remarked that Pelton's treachery had caused inestimable damage to US signals intelligence. All this for payment of $35,000, a sum that was not even enough to settle Pelton's debts. Shortly after his conviction, Pelton was debriefed by the FBI in an effort to discover the extent of the harm that he had caused. While he spoke at length about the sort of information he gave to the Soviets, the FBI always had the sense that Pelton was holding back on them. To test this theory, in 1987, the FBI sent a woman posing as a lawyer acting for a local newspaper to speak to Pelton. Thinking everything he said was subject to attorney-client privilege, Pelton finally opened the floodgates, revealing a myriad other NSA secrets that he had sold. The statement that the fictitious lawyer walked away with that day is said to have contained information so sensitive that it was decided not to bring further charges against Pelton for fear of the details being aired in court. After a failed appeal, Pelton served his mandatory 30 years behind bars at the Anne Arundel County Detention Center. Just before Thanksgiving in 2015, he was paroled. Then aged 74 and penniless, Pelton returned to a world that had forgotten him. He lived with his daughter in Maryland until his death on the 6th of September 2022. In comparison to his peers, the name Ronald Pelton remains obscure, just a vestige of 1985's Year of the Spy. When he was caught, Pelton had already left the spying game. There were other American spies, Aldrich Ames and Robert Hansen in particular, who are believed to have caused far more harm than Pelton. There are many unanswered questions around his compromise by Vitaly Yurchenko. Some counterintelligence officials believe that Yurchenko was in fact a triple agent, sent to betray Edward Lee Howard and Ronald Pelton in order to protect Aldrich Ames, the KGB's more valuable American asset. Pelton, like Howard, may have been just a throwaway spy, a convenient way for the KGB to shift the blame to a man who was no longer of any value. Scapegoat or not, Ronald Pelton sold out his country, and for that will always be remembered as a traitor. Thank you to Incogni for sponsoring this video. Be sure to follow the link in the description to claim the amazing discount.